Tonight, we uncover a bond so secret it stretches back to the age of the Pharaohs. A hidden alliance where sacred power crossed from the banks of the Nile to the heart of Rome, carried not by armies, but by symbols, rituals, and forbidden knowledge. For centuries, the Vatican has stood as the centre of Christian faith. Yet buried within its archives lie echoes of Egypt, a silent inheritance of pyramids, gods, and cosmic mysteries disguised in new robes. This is not just about statues and obelisks taken from the desert. It is about wisdom repackaged, myths reborn, and rituals rewritten to serve a different throne. From the resurrection of Osiris to the infallibility of popes, from hieroglyphs to sacred Latin, the line between Egypt and the Vatican is far thinner than we are told. Beneath the marble halls of St. Peter's lies a question that has never been answered. Did the Vatican preserve Egypt's light for the world, or did it steal it, bury it, and keep humanity in the dark? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we walk the hidden bridge between the Nile and the Tiber, where some truths were never meant to be revealed. There is a rumour older than Rome, whispered in the cracks of history, that the Vatican once shared a hidden alliance with the Pharaohs of Egypt, a pact not carved in stone but sealed in silence, buried beneath centuries of faith and shadow. Imagine two of the greatest forces in human history, the priests of the Nile and the clerics of the Tiber, quietly exchanging secrets not meant for the world. It sounds impossible, yet fragments of evidence suggest that what the Vatican guards in its deepest vaults may not be purely Christian, but infused with echoes of the Pharaoh's forbidden wisdom. When Rome conquered Egypt in the 1st century before Christ, they did not simply take its land, they took its symbols, its gods, its architecture, and perhaps most importantly, its hidden sciences. The Vatican we know today was built upon that Rome, and just as Rome absorbed the mysteries of the Nile, the church that rose upon its ruins may have inherited more than it dares to confess. Why do Egyptian obelisks, sacred to the sun god Ra, stand proudly in the very heart of Vatican City? Why do papal rituals echo the priestly ceremonies once performed on the banks of the Nile? These are not coincidences, they are traces, faint fingerprints of a bond that stretches back across millennia. The story begins not with Christianity's triumph, but with its silence, the long period when knowledge passed from one empire to another like contraband. Egypt was a land where writing itself was believed to shape reality, where priests commanded medicine, astronomy, and geometry with a precision Rome envied. These were not ordinary teachings, but tools of power, capable of shaping the destiny of civilizations. When Christianity rose in the ashes of Rome, would its leaders have dared destroy such knowledge, or did they quietly claim it as their own? Consider this. The Vatican's secret archive, a labyrinth said to stretch over 50 kilometers, holds millions of documents unseen by the world. What if among them are papyri rescued from the fires of Alexandria? What if some of the prayers whispered in Latin have their true origin in the chants of Egyptian priests to Osiris, Isis, and Thoth? And what if the very structure of papal authority, the idea of a single man ruling as the divine voice on earth, is less a Christian innovation and more a continuation of the pharaohs, the god-kings who once ruled under the sun? For centuries, the Church has claimed to be the guardian of divine truth. But history suggests another possibility, that it is also the guardian of something older, something Egyptian, something that was never meant to be Christian at all. If this is true, then the Vatican is not only the centre of Catholic faith, it is the last surviving temple of Egypt, draped in new robes, holding within its vaults the knowledge of a lost civilization. And if those secrets were ever revealed, our entire understanding of faith, history, and human destiny would be torn open. What if the Vatican's true power has always been that it is not only Rome's heir, but Egypt's as well? And what if that ancient pact still shapes the world we live in today? Long before the Vatican raised its great domes over Rome, Another influence had already seeped into the city's stones. It came not from Greece or the Germanic tribes, but from the Nile, carried across the Mediterranean by soldiers, merchants, and priests. By the time Christianity arrived, Rome was already a city echoing with Egyptian voices. Temples to Isis stood side by side with shrines to Jupiter. Egyptian priests walked openly in the forum, chanting prayers in a language most Romans did not understand but instinctively revered. Rome did not resist Egypt's culture. It absorbed it, reshaping its identity, until even Roman emperors bowed to the symbols of the pharaohs. One of the most striking reminders of this strange union still stands today: the obelisks. Tall stone pillars carved with hieroglyphs, once raised to honor the sun god Ra, now dot the piazzas of Rome. 13 of them survive, more than in all of Egypt itself. How did they get there? They were dragged across the sea by emperors like Augustus and Caligula, who believed that by stealing Egypt's sacred symbols, they were also seizing its divine authority. These obelisks were not decorations. They were trophies of power, each one a reminder that Rome had conquered the land of the gods. Yet in a strange twist of fate, many of those same obelisks were later crowned with Christian crosses, baptized into the faith, and placed in front of churches, and even in the heart of Vatican City. The cult of Isis, in particular, spread like wildfire through Rome. By the 1st century before Christ, her temples stretched from Pompeii to Gaul. She was worshipped as the mother of magic, the queen of the heavens, and the bringer of life after death. Her followers carried sistrum rattles, wore white linen robes, and prayed for salvation not unlike Christians would later do. It is no coincidence that when the Virgin Mary was elevated in Christian devotion, she inherited many of the titles once sung to Isis. The Romans may have believed they had conquered Egypt, but in truth, Egypt had quietly conquered their imagination. Even the emperors themselves could not escape this pull. Julius Caesar was famously enchanted by Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, who was not just a queen, but the high priestess of Egyptian magic. Their union produced a son, Caesarion, whom Cleopatra declared to be the son of a god. Later emperors, like Hadrian and Caracalla, travelled to Egypt to immerse themselves in its rituals, leaving behind temples and inscriptions that prove their devotion. They wore amulets inscribed with hieroglyphs and sought out Egyptian priests for counsel in matters of fate, war, and the stars. By the time Christianity began to spread, Roman life was already infused with Egyptian symbols and rituals. To speak of resurrection, to kneel before a mother figure, to imagine judgment after death, these were not foreign ideas. They were echoes of Egypt, already woven into Roman belief. The Vatican that later rose in Rome did not emerge on empty ground. It was built on layers of Egyptian influence, foundations that had been buried but not erased. And when the Church claimed to hold the keys to heaven, perhaps it was not only the cross it held, but also the shadow of the Ankh, the ancient Egyptian sign of eternal life. Along the banks of the Nile thousands of years ago, power was never just about armies or gold. It was about who held the secrets of the gods. The Egyptian priesthood guarded those secrets with absolute control. They were astronomers, healers, mathematicians, and scribes, but more than anything, they were mediators between the divine and the living. If the pharaoh was a god on earth, the priests were the ones who kept his divinity alive through rituals, words, and hidden knowledge. Without them, the kingdom would have collapsed into chaos. Their authority was sacred and unquestionable, and the people accepted that their souls depended on the wisdom held within the temple walls. Now travel forward in time to Rome, long after the pyramids had already weathered centuries of desert winds. When Christianity rose and the Vatican emerged, it created a new order of men dressed not in white linen but in black robes. Yet their role was strikingly similar. They too claimed to hold the keys to the divine. They too insisted that no soul could reach salvation without their guidance. And they too surrounded themselves with symbols, rituals, and sacred texts that only they were allowed to interpret. The Egyptian priests, spoke the language of the gods through hieroglyphs, a script ordinary people could not understand. The Vatican clerics spoke Latin, a tongue that by the Middle Ages was equally closed to the common believer. Both systems relied on mystery, on the idea that holiness was too powerful to be shared freely. Consider the layout of a great Egyptian temple. At the front, the public gathered in open courtyards. Deeper inside, access narrowed. Only priests could pass through the hypostyle halls into the sacred chambers. At the very heart, in the Holy of Holies, stood the god's image, hidden from all but the high priest. Now compare that to St. Peter's Basilica or any grand cathedral. The faithful gather in the nave, watching from afar. But the altar, the Eucharist, the tabernacle, these lie beyond, accessible only to ordained priests. The idea is the same. The divine is present, but only through the mediators who claim the right to approach it. In Egypt, priests used rituals to guide the dead through the afterlife. They recited passages from the Book of the Dead, maps for the soul to reach paradise. In the Vatican, priests administer last rites, prayers meant to deliver the dying into heaven. The scripts are different, the gods are named differently, but the role of the priest remains constant. They are gatekeepers of eternity. Even their relationship to rulers mirrors one another. In Egypt, pharaohs ruled by divine right, but their legitimacy always depended on the blessings of the priests. In Rome, emperors were replaced by popes who crowned kings, declared them chosen by God, and even had the power to excommunicate them if they strayed. Just as no pharaoh could reign without the temple, no medieval king could rule without the church. The Nile and the Tiber may flow in different lands, but their guardians of faith stood in the same role. They both shaped belief, controlled memory, and claimed that between heaven and earth, no truth existed without their approval. And perhaps that is why the Vatican's power feels timeless, because it inherited not only Rome's empire, but Egypt's oldest secret, the art of ruling souls through the sacred authority of priests. There is a question that lingers like a shadow over the halls of the Vatican. When Rome inherited Egypt's treasures of knowledge, were they stolen to be erased or preserved to be hidden? The difference may decide whether the Church is guilty of theft or whether it has acted as the world's most secretive guardian. The story begins with the fall of Egypt to Rome in the 1st century before Christ. Soldiers carried away more than gold and statues. They brought home manuscripts written on fragile papyrus, sacred rituals whispered by priests of Isis and Osiris, and astronomical records that had guided the building of pyramids. These fragments of knowledge were unlike anything in Rome, and the emperors knew their value. To control Egypt's wisdom was to control the mysteries of life and death. When Christianity later rose and absorbed the remnants of Rome, did the Church destroy these fragments as heresy, or did it quietly place them under lock and key? There are signs that preservation, rather than destruction, may have been the path chosen. Why else would so many Egyptian obelisks be standing today in Rome, including one directly at the centre of St. Peter's Square? These were not smashed to dust. They were rebranded with crosses and made to stand as trophies of a church that claimed dominion over both the old gods and the new. It suggests the Vatican understood the power of Egyptian symbols and kept them alive, not out of respect, but as tools of authority. Yet this preservation came with silence. No effort was made to explain their original meaning to the people. Knowledge was not shared, it was sealed away. Some argue that the Church deliberately rewrote Egypt's wisdom into Christian forms. The resurrection of Osiris became the resurrection of Christ. The protective mother Isis transformed into the Virgin Mary. The Ankh, symbol of eternal life, evolved into the Christian cross. Was this theft? A stripping of Egypt's heritage to serve a new religion? Or was it preservation, ensuring that truths too dangerous for a fragile world survived beneath new names? The line between the two is thin, and perhaps it was both. Consider the Vatican's secret archive. It stretches for miles beneath the city, holding more than 1 million documents. Scholars whisper that hidden among its shelves are texts from the Library of Alexandria, manuscripts smuggled across the sea before the flames consumed them. If true, then Egypt's greatest treasures may not have been lost, but are instead resting in silence beneath Rome. But preservation without access is a kind of theft. A book unread is a book destroyed in spirit, even if its pages remain intact. This is the tension that surrounds the Vatican's role. Did it save Egyptian wisdom for humanity, waiting for a time when the world could understand it? Or did it steal and reshape it, using fragments of another civilization to build its own empire of faith? The truth may be somewhere in between. What is clear is that Egypt never fully died. Its voice still echoes in the chants of churches, its symbols still rise in Vatican squares, and its secrets may still sleep in vaults where no sunlight has touched them for centuries. In the temples of ancient Egypt, there was a class of men feared and revered above all others. They were the priests of Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and the hidden sciences. To ordinary people, they seemed almost supernatural, men who could read the stars, cure the sick, and even guide the soul after death. Their power did not come from swords or armies. It came from knowledge, carefully guarded and passed from generation to generation inside sacred halls where no commoner was ever allowed to enter. These priests were the living libraries of their time, the keepers of medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and the sacred language of hieroglyphs. Without them, the kingdom of Egypt would have been a body without a mind. The priests of Thoth were healers long before the world used the word doctor. They studied the human body through observation, herbs, and even surgery. Some papyri that survive today describe treatments for wounds, dental procedures, and even recipes for anesthesia using plants. To the villagers who lived along the Nile, such knowledge must have looked like magic. To the priests it was sacred science, wisdom gifted by Thoth himself. And when this knowledge travelled across time, echoes of it reappeared in Greek medicine, Roman healing practices, and perhaps later inside the monasteries of Europe, where the Vatican preserved fragments of older traditions. Their mastery of the sky was just as profound. The priests of Thoth were among the first astronomers, tracking the movement of stars with such accuracy that they created a calendar more precise than Rome's. They used the rising of Sirius to predict the flooding of the Nile, the event that determined whether Egypt would feast or starve. These calculations were not just practical, they were spiritual. The stars were thought to be the script of the gods, and by reading them, the priests could see into destiny itself. Later, when the Vatican became the guardian of calendars and time, one cannot help but wonder if it was repeating a pattern first drawn along the banks of the Nile. But perhaps their greatest treasure was language. The priests of Thoth guarded hieroglyphs as a sacred script, a language of symbols that could not only describe reality, but command it. To write a word was to bring its essence into being. This belief gave enormous power to those who could read and write. The average farmer could not. Only the priests could, and this monopoly on knowledge meant they controlled history itself. Stories, laws, and sacred truths were all filtered through them. In this way, they did not just preserve the past, they shaped it. The Vatican centuries later would do the same with Latin, a language locked away from ordinary believers, a tongue that gave priests sole control over the sacred texts of Christianity. The priests of Thoth may have vanished, but their shadow lingers in every institution that claims exclusive access to wisdom. Their temples may have fallen to ruin, but the idea that knowledge is a form of divine power has never disappeared. Perhaps when the Vatican built its secret vaults, it was unknowingly copying a model already perfected by the keepers of Thoth, men who understood that the greatest power of all is not ruling land, but ruling memory and truth. To the ancient Egyptians, writing was never just a way to record thoughts or count grain. Writing was magic, a living force that could shape reality itself. They called their sacred script the words of the gods, and they believed every symbol carried a hidden spark of divine power. These symbols were hieroglyphs, carved into stone, painted on tomb walls, or written on papyrus scrolls. Each one was more than a picture. A falcon was not only a bird, it was Horus, the sky god. A spiral was not only a curve, it was the unfolding of creation. When priests of Egypt traced these signs, they were not simply describing the world, they were calling it into being. This belief made writing dangerous in the wrong hands. Ordinary people were not taught hieroglyphs. Only the priestly class and scribes dedicated to the temples could unlock them. They believed that to know a word was to hold the essence of the thing it named. To write a spell was to force the gods to listen. To carve a curse into stone was to trap an enemy's soul. Even names were seen as magical. To erase a name from monuments was to erase that person's afterlife. This is why pharaohs who fell out of favour were chiselled out of history. Their memory was literally destroyed through the power of the written word. Sound itself was thought to be creative. When a priest spoke a ritual out loud, the vibration of the words was believed to stir the universe. Chants and prayers were not mere recitations, they were engines of reality. The Book of the Dead, filled with spells for guiding the soul after death, worked only if the words were read with the correct intonation. A missed syllable could mean eternal wandering. In this way, sound, symbol, and meaning became one. The spoken word and the written word fused into an invisible energy that shaped both heaven and earth. It is not hard to see how echoes of this belief carried forward. In the Christian Church, Latin became its own kind of hieroglyphic tongue. Ordinary believers could not read it, yet priests declared it holy and powerful. The Mass was performed in Latin not for understanding but for the weight of its sound, much like the Egyptian chants that stirred temples thousands of years before. Sacred names, whether of Egyptian gods or Christian saints, were repeated to create protection, healing, or miracles. The philosophy was the same. Words shape the unseen. Even today, we live under the shadow of this ancient idea. Symbols carry more weight than we admit. A cross carved in stone, a star drawn in secret, a name whispered in a prayer. These are descendants of the hieroglyphs once carved on tomb walls by torchlight. The Egyptians believed that as long as their words remained visible, their civilization would never truly die. Perhaps that is why the Vatican guards ancient manuscripts so tightly. For if words can create reality, then those who control the words control the world itself. Long before the word alchemy was whispered in medieval cloisters, its roots were already alive in the sands of Egypt. The very word alchemy comes from the Arabic term alchimia, which itself traces back to Chem, the ancient name of Egypt, meaning the Black Land, a reference to the fertile soil of the Nile. To the Egyptians, transformation was not just a natural process, it was a sacred art. They believed metals could be purified, substances could be changed, and even the human soul itself could be refined like gold rising out of base stone. What later became known as alchemy in Europe began as the temple science of Egypt. The priests of Egypt studied how minerals reacted under heat, how plants could be mixed to heal or poison, and how dyes could bring new colours to fabrics. To the outside world, these looked like miracles. To the priests, they were glimpses into the hidden laws of the universe. They believed that everything carried both a visible and invisible form. By working with matter, they could reach spirit. Melting copper or shaping gold was not only craft, it was prayer in motion. The pyramid texts speak of transformation not only for objects, but for the soul of the dead pharaoh, who was said to ascend like refined metal rising toward the sky. This blending of matter and spirit formed the foundation of alchemy. When Greeks entered Egypt during the time of Alexander, they found themselves astonished by this secret knowledge. Many of the earliest Greek writings on alchemy were nothing more than Egyptian wisdom translated into another tongue. Later, when Rome took Egypt, this current of knowledge did not vanish. It travelled quietly through Alexandria, through hidden manuscripts, through the whispers of scholars who dared to protect fragments of Egyptian science from the flames. some of these writings would one day reappear in Europe and be copied by monks who may not have fully understood their meaning but sensed their power. In the Middle Ages, alchemy was often mocked as foolish men trying to turn lead into gold. But to those who truly knew, it was about far more than wealth. It was about transformation of the soul. That idea comes directly from Egypt. The Book of the Dead describes the heart being weighed against the feather of truth, a judgment of purity. This was spiritual alchemy, the refining of the human being so that the soul could pass into eternity. The Vatican later taught about purification of the soul through confession and penance, but the roots of that concept can be traced back to the Nile, where purification was not moral alone, but cosmic, an alignment with the laws of creation itself. Even now, some of the symbols of alchemy carry Egyptian echoes. The Ouroboros, the serpent eating its tail, first appeared in Egyptian papyri as a sign of eternal cycles. The philosopher's stone, said to perfect all things, mirrors the Benben stone of Heliopolis, the cosmic seed from which creation first emerged. Egypt laid the blueprint, the world simply renamed it. And if the Vatican ever held on to these old texts, it means they were not only hiding secrets of gold and fire, but also the hidden key to human transformation itself. For the ancient Egyptians, death was never an ending but a journey, a dangerous passage through unknown realms where the soul had to face trials before reaching eternal life. To prepare for this journey, they created one of the most mysterious and powerful texts in human history, the Book of the Dead. It was not a single book, but a collection of spells, prayers, and instructions written on papyrus scrolls and painted on tomb walls. Each spell was a key, a safeguard to protect the soul from monsters, traps, and divine judges who waited beyond the veil. To die without these words was to risk wandering forever in darkness. To die with them was to have a map to eternity. The Egyptians believed that after death, every person would stand before the god Osiris to be judged. The heart was placed on a scale and weighed against the feather of truth. If the heart was pure, the soul entered paradise, a field of endless harvest where joy never ceased. If the heart was heavy with sin, it was devoured by a monster, and the soul vanished into nothingness. This vision of judgment, paradise, and eternal punishment did not disappear with Egypt's fall. It re-emerged centuries later inside the Vatican's teachings of heaven and hell. The idea that every soul must face a final trial, that sins are recorded, and that eternity hangs in the balance. This is a direct echo of the Nile. Consider the language of the Book of the Dead. The soul is told to confess innocence before 42 divine judges, declaring, "I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not lied." Centuries later, Christian confession adopted the same structure, an admission of sins before a priest to secure forgiveness. Even the Vatican's imagery of demons tormenting the wicked reflects the creatures painted in Egyptian tombs, beings with crocodile heads, snake tails, and lion jaws. The names changed, but the fear and the promise remained the same. The Church did not copy Egypt openly. Instead, it reshaped the narrative. Where Osiris once sat as judge, Christ now ruled. Where the feather of truth once measured the soul, the cross became the standard. But the core idea was familiar. The soul is tested. Heaven is a reward, hell is a punishment. And like the Egyptian priests, Vatican clerics became the guides of the journey. In place of papyrus spells, they offered prayers, masses, indulgences, and sacraments. Each one said to open doors in the afterlife. It is tempting to ask whether this was preservation or appropriation. Did the Vatican adopt Egyptian visions of the afterlife because they were timeless truths, or did it repurpose them to build its own system of control through fear of eternal fire? The answer may lie somewhere in between. The Egyptians believed that knowledge of the afterlife had to be guarded by priests so that only the worthy could pass. The Vatican followed the same logic, claiming that salvation could only come through the Church. In this way, the Book of the Dead did not vanish. It was reborn, disguised under Latin chants and cathedral ceilings, still guiding souls through a passage no one has ever returned from to describe. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was more than a king. He was the bridge between the human and the divine, a living god whose word was law not only on earth but in heaven. His commands were believed to carry divine authority, and to disobey him was to defy the gods themselves. Temples depicted pharaohs standing shoulder to shoulder with deities, offering sacrifices and receiving the symbols of eternal life. Statues carved in stone showed them larger than ordinary men, embodying the idea that their power was beyond mortal limits. To the people of Egypt, the pharaoh was not simply a ruler, he was the divine will made flesh. This concept of sacred kingship was not unique to the Nile, but in Egypt it reached its most powerful expression. Every pharaoh was the son of Ra, the sun god, and the earthly incarnation of Horus, the falcon god of kingship. At death, he became Osiris, the god of the underworld, continuing his rule beyond the grave. His divinity was not symbolic. It was literal, woven into the rituals of state, the festivals of the calendar, and the very architecture of the pyramids, which stood as stairways for his soul to ascend to the heavens. His authority was absolute because it was believed to come directly from the gods. Centuries later, in the heart of Rome, the Vatican would rise with a strangely similar idea at its core. The Pope was not called a god, but he was declared the vicar of Christ, the earthly representative of the divine. In the doctrine of papal infallibility, established formally in the 19th century, but practiced long before, the Pope's teachings on matters of faith were said to be without error. His words carried the weight of heaven itself. To question him was to question God. This is eerily close to the pharaohs, whose commands were beyond challenge because they were considered the voice of the gods on earth. The rituals reinforced this similarity. Just as pharaohs were crowned in ceremonies filled with sacred symbols, popes are crowned or enthroned with elaborate rites that proclaim their spiritual supremacy. Just as pharaohs were depicted holding the crook and flail as signs of divine authority, popes hold the crozier and wear the triple crown, each object heavy with symbolism of universal rule. Even the imagery of being surrounded by priests and attendants, guiding the people not just in law but in salvation, mirrors the role of the pharaoh as the high priest of every temple. The political theology is the same. Power is not merely political, it is sacred. It is wrapped in rituals that make obedience not a duty to man, but a duty to the divine. The Vatican may claim its authority stems from Christ, but the structure of that authority feels ancient, as if borrowed from civilizations that long understood the power of declaring a man to be beyond human limits. This continuity raises a question. Did the Vatican inherit more from Egypt than stone obelisks and symbols? Did it also inherit the idea that one man could stand as the mouth of the divine, shaping not just laws but belief itself? If so, then the pharaohs of the Nile did not vanish into the sands. They live on, reshaped in white robes and golden mitres, ruling not from pyramids but from St. Peter's throne. There is perhaps no tragedy in history more haunting than the destruction of the great library of Alexandria. Built in the 3rd century before Christ under the rule of Ptolemy II, it was said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls gathered from every corner of the known world. Ships docking in Alexandria were searched, and any manuscripts found on board were copied and added to the library's shelves. It was more than a storehouse of books, it was the beating heart of human knowledge. Mathematics from Babylon, astronomy from Mesopotamia, philosophy from Greece, and medicine from Egypt itself all rested together beneath its roof. If it had survived, the world we live in today might be centuries more advanced. Yet the library was lost in flames, and the story of its destruction has become one of the great mysteries of civilization. Historians argue over who destroyed it. Some blame Julius Caesar during his siege of Alexandria in 48 before Christ, when fire from burning ships spread to the docks and possibly the library. Others say it was Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century after Christ, or even Theophilus in the 4th century who ordered pagan temples destroyed. Still others believe the final blow came with the Muslim conquest of Egypt in the 7th century. The truth is, we may never know exactly when the last scroll turned to ash. What we do know is that knowledge was lost on a scale too vast to imagine. But was it all destroyed? That is where the story takes a darker turn. Whispers have long suggested that not every manuscript vanished in fire. Some claim that before the flames consumed the shelves, certain texts were smuggled out. Wealthy scholars, secretive priests, and conquering generals may have carried away portions of the collection. And where could such treasures have ended up? One name rises again and again: Rome. When Christianity rose and the Vatican built its immense network of archives, it suddenly became the guardian of documents older than its own faith. Could some of those have been relics of Alexandria, hidden away not to protect humanity, but to keep them under lock and key? The Vatican's secret archive today stretches more than 50 kilometers. Its collection is said to hold more than 1 million manuscripts. Only a handful of scholars are ever allowed to enter, and even they see only fragments. If texts from Alexandria survived, this would be the most likely place they rest. Imagine scrolls describing lost inventions, ancient maps showing lands unknown to medieval Europe, medical formulas centuries ahead of their time, or astronomical records that could rewrite history. If even a fraction of these are hidden beneath Vatican stone, then the world has been living in the shadow of a theft disguised as tragedy. The burning of the library is remembered as the death of knowledge. But perhaps it was not death at all. Perhaps it was a transfer. The flames erased the public's access, while the most powerful guardians of faith carried the light into secrecy. And if that is true, then the greatest loss of Alexandria was not that its wisdom was destroyed, but that it was stolen, preserved in silence, waiting in darkness beneath the Vatican, where only a chosen few may ever turn its pages again. In the dry deserts of Egypt during the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ, a strange movement began. Men and women left behind the noise of the cities, abandoned wealth, family, and even safety to live in caves and huts scattered across the sands. They became known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the first Christian monks. To the outside world, their choices seemed mad. Yet their lifestyle was not entirely new. It was built on something much older, the spiritual traditions of Egypt itself. These early monks may have believed they were creating a new way of life, but in truth, they were absorbing fragments of Egyptian mysticism that had been alive along the Nile for thousands of years. The Egyptians had always seen the desert as sacred, a place where gods revealed themselves and where the soul was tested. Long before Christianity, the priests of Egypt had retreated into silence to fast, to pray, and to seek visions in the barren wilderness. In their temples, rituals of purification through isolation were practiced as a way of aligning the self with divine order. When Christian monks fled to the desert centuries later, they followed the same pattern. They fasted for weeks at a time, they meditated in caves, they kept long silences, and they believed that by stripping away the noise of the world, they could hear the voice of God. It was an inheritance more ancient than their own scriptures. One of the most famous of these figures was Anthony the Great, who retreated into the desert in the year 250. Stories of his battles with demons, his visions of angels, and his miracles spread quickly. Yet if you compare these tales with Egyptian mystical traditions, you find striking similarities. Egyptian priests had long spoken of spirits that tested seekers, of initiations that required strength of mind, and of visions of gods appearing in blinding light. The Desert Fathers described the same experiences, but gave them new names, replacing the gods of Egypt with angels and devils from the Bible. The structure remained the same, even if the language had changed. As monasticism grew, entire communities of monks formed in the deserts of Egypt. They built cells and churches, but their practices remained rooted in solitude, fasting, and prayer. Many of their teachings spread into Europe, shaping the monasteries that would later dominate medieval Christianity. Yet behind these teachings lay echoes of the Egyptian past. The emphasis on sacred silence, the search for hidden wisdom, and the belief that knowledge should only be revealed to the initiated were all ideas inherited from the mystical priesthoods of Egypt. When the Vatican later embraced monastic orders as a core part of its power, it was unknowingly carrying forward a tradition that had begun not in Rome but in the sands of Egypt. The Desert Fathers were not only Christians seeking God, they were the heirs of a much older path carved by Egyptian mystics, and through them, fragments of that forgotten wisdom flowed into the bloodstream of the Church, shaping a legacy that still lingers in cloisters and monasteries to this very day. When Christianity first spread into Egypt in the 1st century after Christ, it did not arrive to an empty land. Egypt was already soaked in thousands of years of religious tradition, rituals, and sacred language. As the new faith took root, it did not simply erase what came before. It blended with it, adapted to it, and carried parts of it forward in unexpected ways. This fusion became known as Coptic Christianity, a branch of the faith that even today holds echoes of the Pharaohs. It became a bridge between the old gods of Egypt and the new God of the Bible, preserving fragments of pharaonic law under Christian symbols. The very language of the Copts tells this story. Coptic is the final form of the ancient Egyptian tongue, written with Greek letters but still carrying older words that reached back to hieroglyphs. When early Christians in Egypt prayed, they did so in a language that had once been used to summon gods and perform rituals in temples of Isis and Osiris. The sound of those prayers carried echoes of chants thousands of years old. In this way, the voice of Egypt never truly went silent. It was simply reworded. The rituals also carried familiar patterns. Ancient Egyptians had long practiced fasting and periods of abstinence as a way of purifying the body for contact with the divine. Coptic Christians continued this discipline, and even today, the Coptic Church observes some of the longest fasts in Christianity. The idea of saints interceding for the faithful mirrors the older role of Egyptian gods who stood as mediators between humanity and the higher realms. Icons of the Virgin Mary holding the child Jesus resemble statues of Isis, cradling the infant Horus, a symbol so familiar to Egyptians that the transition seemed almost seamless. Coptic monasteries, some of the oldest in the world, became keepers of knowledge. In their libraries, monks preserved not only scriptures but also medical recipes, astrological charts, and fragments of ancient philosophy that echoed pharaonic thought. Many of these texts would later pass quietly into Europe, carried by travellers and scholars, feeding into the growing body of Christian tradition. Without the Copts acting as guardians, much of Egypt's spiritual heritage might have vanished completely. Even the way Coptic Christians viewed the afterlife carried similarities to their ancestors. The idea of judgment, the weighing of deeds, and the hope of eternal paradise survived with new language but familiar imagery. Heaven was no longer the field of reeds of Osiris, but a Christian paradise filled with angels. Yet the structure of belief remained the same. Life was a journey toward a final trial, and the community relied on priests to guide them through both ritual and mystery. The Vatican may have tried to distance itself from the more mystical parts of Christianity, but through the Coptic tradition, the old Egypt flowed quietly beneath the surface. It acted as a bridge, ensuring that even as gods were renamed and temples became churches, the heartbeat of the Nile still pulsed within Christian faith. And perhaps hidden in that survival is proof that some truths are too powerful to be erased, living on in new forms until the world is ready to see them for what they truly are. When Rome first encountered the goddess Isis, she was not treated as a foreign deity to be rejected. She was embraced, honoured, and eventually adored by thousands across the empire. Her temples stood in Pompeii, in Gaul, in Britain, and of course in Rome itself. To many Romans, Isis became the universal mother, a figure of compassion and power who listened to prayers, healed the sick, and promised life after death. Her cult spread so widely that even emperors participated in her festivals. By the time Christianity began to rise, the devotion to Isis was already woven into Roman life. And when devotion to the Virgin Mary appeared centuries later, it carried with it the unmistakable shadow of Isis. Isis had long been worshipped in Egypt as the divine mother, wife of Osiris and protector of Horus the child. She was the image of nurturing love and unbreakable strength. When her cult reached Rome in the 1st century before Christ, it gained new meaning. Ordinary people, especially women, were drawn to her, for she was accessible in ways the traditional Roman gods were not. Her ceremonies were emotional and dramatic, filled with music, chanting, and processions that promised the faithful they were not forgotten. She was not distant like Jupiter or Mars. She was close, a mother who cared. This emotional bond would later reappear almost identically in Marian devotion. The images of Isis often show her seated with the infant Horus on her lap. This symbol of the mother and child became so familiar in the Roman world that when Christianity spread, the transition to Mary and Jesus felt almost natural. The statues of Mary holding the Christ child resembled Isis so closely that many early Christians in Egypt and Rome were accused of simply renaming an older goddess. Even the titles overlapped. Isis was called Queen of Heaven, Star of the Sea, and Mother of God. These same titles would be sung to Mary in hymns centuries later. The rituals also carried over. The annual mourning of Isis for her slain husband Osiris was a drama of death and resurrection that brought comfort to the people. In Christian tradition, the mourning of Mary for her crucified son echoed this theme. The processions, the candles, the songs of grief and hope all followed patterns already familiar to a population shaped by Isis worship. The Vatican may never openly admit it, but Marian devotion was born in soil already prepared by the cult of Isis. This does not mean that Mary and Isis are the same figure, but it does mean the Church absorbed a spiritual hunger that Isis once fulfilled. People longed for a divine mother, for comfort and compassion in a harsh world. Rather than resist, Christianity provided that image in Mary. Over time, Marian devotion became one of the most powerful forces in Catholicism, inspiring pilgrimages, shrines, and miracles. But its roots reach back to Egypt, where Isis first taught people to see the divine not only as a father, but also as a mother. And in that sense, every Ave Maria whispered in a church may still carry the echo of an older prayer once spoken in the temples of Isis. Among the many symbols that survived from the Nile to Rome, none is more striking than the Ankh. Known as the key of life, it was carried by gods and pharaohs alike, always shown in their hands as a sign of eternal existence. Shaped like a cross with a loop at the top, it represented breath, vitality, and the promise that life would continue beyond death. For the Egyptians, it was not just a sign, but a guarantee that creation itself was bound to cycles of renewal. When Christianity rose centuries later, another symbol took center stage, the cross. It was not carved with a loop, but its message of life through death and resurrection echoed the very meaning of the Ankh. The question is whether this was coincidence or borrowing. The Ankh was everywhere in Egypt. Painted on tomb walls, carved into sarcophagi, etched on amulets, and carried by priests during rituals. It was placed in the hands of the dead to ensure their rebirth in the afterlife. The loop was said to symbolize the eternal soul, while the arms represented the world of the living. The Egyptians believed that to hold the Ankh was to hold power over both realms. When Christianity adopted the cross as its most sacred sign, it carried the same promise of eternal life, not through pharaohs and gods of the Nile, but through the sacrifice of Christ. Yet, to the eyes of those who knew both, the similarity was too close to ignore. In early Christian art of Egypt, known as Coptic art, Ankhs and crosses even appear together. Some crosses were drawn with loops at the top, merging the two symbols into one. This blending suggests that the transition from the old religion to the new was not a clean break, but a transformation. Believers who once saw the Ankh as the sign of life began to see the cross in the same way. Instead of Ra or Osiris granting eternal life, it was now Christ. The shape changed slightly, but the message remained. The Vatican itself is surrounded by echoes of this connection. The papal staff sometimes takes the form of a cross topped with a looped handle, resembling the ancient Ankh. Even the language of eternal life, so central to Christian teaching, mirrors the Egyptian promise of continuity beyond death. To live forever was not a Christian invention. It was an inheritance. The symbol of how that promise was represented simply shifted from the temples of the Nile to the basilicas of Rome. The power of symbols lies in their ability to cross boundaries of time and culture. The Ankh was once the most sacred image of Egypt. The cross became the most sacred image of Christianity. Both carried the same core idea, that death was not the end, and that those who followed the divine would rise into eternity. Whether the Church consciously borrowed the Ankh, or whether the resemblance is a coincidence, the truth is clear. The Ankh never truly disappeared. It was reborn in the cross, carried not by pharaohs but by popes, still promising the same eternal truth whispered along the banks of the Nile thousands of years before. If you walk through Rome today, you will see tall stone giants piercing the sky, Egyptian obelisks standing in plazas, near fountains, and most mysteriously, at the very heart of Vatican City. These monuments are thousands of years old, carved from single blocks of granite, dragged across the desert, and raised in honor of the gods of Egypt. Yet instead of crumbling in the sands where they were first built, many of them now rise above the streets of Rome, crowned not with the sun disk of Ra, but with the cross of Christ. How did so many of these ancient monuments find their way into the capital of Christianity, and why does the Vatican protect them so carefully? Obelisks were sacred in Egypt. They were designed as frozen rays of the sun, symbols of divine light striking the earth. They stood in pairs at temple entrances, as if to declare that anyone who entered was stepping into the domain of eternity. The pointed tips were often capped with gold to reflect the sunlight, connecting heaven and earth in a single shining line. To the Egyptians, they were physical prayers carved in stone, reaching toward the sky with messages only the gods could hear. When Rome conquered Egypt, it carried away more than treasures of gold. It took these obelisks and planted them in the empire's heart as symbols of domination. To steal an obelisk was to steal the power of the pharaohs and claim it for the Caesars. Yet centuries later, when the Vatican rose to power, it did not destroy these obelisks, it embraced them. In St. Peter's Square, the most famous of them stands directly at the centre, older than Christianity itself, a silent witness to the rise and fall of empires. At its tip now sits a cross, but beneath that cross rests the stone carved for an Egyptian god more than 3,000 years ago. Why would the Vatican keep such symbols? Perhaps because it recognized the same truth the Egyptians had. These stones radiate authority. Their size, their age, and their impossible craftsmanship make them more than monuments. They are statements of power. By placing them in Christian plazas, the Vatican sent a message that it now held the secrets and the light once claimed by Egypt. It was not a rejection of the old ways, but a quiet absorption of them. Even deeper, some whisper that obelisks are not just art, but tools. Their shapes, their alignment, and their placement may connect with celestial patterns, turning cities into giant calendars or sacred maps. If that is true, then the Vatican's choice to guard them is not symbolic alone. It is functional, preserving an ancient technology of stone and star. Whether used consciously or kept for their mystery, these obelisks bind the Vatican to the pharaohs in a way few notice. They are reminders carved in granite that the Church, which claims to hold heaven's keys, also holds Egypt's oldest symbols of divine authority, standing proudly not in the desert but in the heart of Rome. When you step into the crypts beneath the great basilicas of Rome, you find yourself in a world of marble, shadows, and silence. These are the papal tombs, final resting places of men who ruled not kingdoms of earth but kingdoms of faith. Their graves are not simple. They are carved with precision, filled with symbols, and often built with an ambition that reaches beyond ordinary burial. In their design, there is something strangely familiar, something that echoes across centuries to the sands of Egypt. The tombs of the popes mirror in their grandeur and symbolism the funerary traditions of the pharaohs. Both speak the same language, the language of death as transformation and architecture as a gateway to eternity. The Egyptians perfected the art of eternal rest. Their pyramids were not merely graves, but machines of resurrection, designed with astronomical alignments and filled with spells, treasures, and sacred geometry, meant to carry the soul into the afterlife. Every stone was placed to channel power, every passage designed to guide the spirit upward. For the pharaoh, death was not the end, it was a doorway, the pyramid was the key. Centuries later in Rome, the tombs of popes carried the same ambition, though cloaked in Christian form. Their crypts were placed beneath cathedrals, the holiest sites of the faith, and were decorated with symbols meant to proclaim eternal life. Like the pyramids, they were more than monuments. They were bridges between the world of the living and the realm of the divine. Look closely at the papal tombs, and you find pyramid echoes. The shape itself appears in Christian art and architecture, sometimes hidden, sometimes overt. The pyramid was a sign of ascension, of stability, of eternal truth rising from the earth to the heavens. In Rome, the same message is delivered through domes and triangular designs, but the meaning is unchanged. Just as the pharaoh was buried at the heart of his pyramid to be reborn as Osiris, the Pope is buried at the heart of a basilica to be remembered as the eternal shepherd of the Church. The message to the faithful is clear: the leader does not die, he transcends. The treasures placed with pharaohs may have vanished into sand, but popes too were buried with relics, sacred objects, and inscriptions of power. Their sarcophagi were carved with biblical scenes that served the same purpose as Egyptian wall paintings, to remind the soul of its story and to secure its passage into paradise. Even the placement of the tombs beneath massive structures is an echo of the pharaohs, as if the weight of stone above anchors their memory for eternity. This resemblance cannot be brushed aside as coincidence. Both Egypt and the Vatican understood that architecture could do more than house the dead. It could tell the living a story of power and permanence. The pyramids proclaimed that pharaohs were gods. The papal tombs whisper that popes are beyond ordinary men. In both cases, the message carved into stone is the same. Death does not erase authority, it immortalizes it. And so, beneath the marble floors of Rome, the pyramids of Egypt find their shadow, still rising in silence, though their shape has changed. In the ruins of Egypt, after the age of the pharaohs, a new body of writings began to appear, texts whispered to have been given by Hermes Trismegistus, a figure said to be part Greek god, part Egyptian sage, and part divine messenger. These works became known as the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of dialogues and teachings blending Egyptian spirituality with Greek philosophy. They spoke of the soul's journey, the unity of all things, the hidden laws of the universe, and the possibility of transforming man into something greater through knowledge. To later readers, they seemed almost prophetic, as if fragments of ancient Egypt had been translated into a new language to survive the ages. But how these manuscripts endured is a story that leads directly into the halls of the church itself. The Hermetic texts were not open to all. They circulated quietly among scholars in Alexandria and beyond, often hidden from public view. They described God as a cosmic mind, creation as a living thought, and humanity as a reflection of the divine. Such ideas were dangerous to rigid authorities, yet they carried an allure too strong to ignore. By the early centuries after Christ, many church fathers were aware of these writings. Some denounced them as pagan, but others sensed in them a hidden truth, echoes of a wisdom older than Christianity itself. In time, certain monks and scholars began to copy and preserve these manuscripts, not to celebrate them publicly, but to keep their knowledge alive within guarded archives. The Vatican would later become one of the main guardians of these Hermetic texts. During the Renaissance, the Corpus Hermeticum re-emerged in Florence, brought from Byzantine collections and translated into Latin. Thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno embraced them, claiming they contained the purest philosophy of the ancient world. Yet, long before this revival, fragments had already been in the possession of church libraries. The irony is that while the Vatican condemned Hermetic ideas as heresy, it also preserved the very manuscripts that carried those ideas forward. They were too powerful to destroy, too dangerous to release. What did the Corpus Hermeticum teach that made it so threatening? It spoke of divine knowledge accessible not only through priests, but through personal awakening. It described the universe as alive with spirit, where stars and planets influenced fate, and where man, by understanding the laws of nature, could rise into communion with the divine. It blurred the line between science, religion, and magic. For a church that claimed sole guardianship of truth, this was unacceptable. Yet by keeping the texts in hidden shelves, the church ensured that no one else could claim them either. Today, many scholars see the Hermetic writings as the last breath of Egyptian wisdom dressed in Greek words. They carried the spirit of Thoth, the god of knowledge, transformed into Hermes, the guide of souls. And in the Vatican's archives, these manuscripts remind us of a strange paradox. The very institution that suppressed free inquiry also safeguarded the seeds of it. The Corpus Hermeticum survived not because the world was ready for its message, but because the Vatican could not decide whether to destroy it or to keep it for itself. Whispers have long surrounded the Vatican's archives, whispers that hidden among the millions of documents are papyri that should not exist in Rome at all. These are said to be Egyptian manuscripts, carried out of the Nile Valley centuries ago, smuggled through wars, conquests, and religious upheavals, only to vanish into the secret vaults of the church. No official catalogue lists them, no scholar can confirm them, yet stories persist, stories of papyrus fragments bearing hieroglyphs and ancient Egyptian prayers tucked away on Vatican shelves where almost no one will ever see them. The tale begins with Alexandria, the greatest centre of learning in the ancient world. When its library fell, whether by fire, conquest, or deliberate destruction, countless papyri were scattered. Some were seized by Roman generals who wanted trophies of knowledge as much as gold. Others were taken by early Christians who viewed pagan texts as both dangerous and valuable. By the time the Vatican rose to power, many of these manuscripts had already passed through monasteries, copied by monks who barely understood the symbols, or hidden by scholars who feared their destruction. The Vatican, with its endless appetite for collecting, may have quietly absorbed these fragments, locking them away before they could vanish. Travellers and historians from the Renaissance spoke of strange papyri glimpsed in Rome, scrolls that did not belong to the Greek or Latin tradition. Some described sheets filled with drawings of gods with falcon heads and serpentine forms. Others spoke of fragments discussing medicine, astronomy, or secret rituals. None of these accounts can be verified today, yet they leave a trail of suspicion. If such texts were real, what became of them? They were placed in the private collection of the Vatican, hidden not out of malice perhaps, but out of fear of their power. Imagine what such papyri could contain: instructions for lost technologies, precise star charts, or ancient maps that contradict accepted history. Spells and rituals that once gave priests their reputation for divine power. Medical recipes with knowledge far beyond medieval Europe. Any of these would have shaken the authority of the Church, which depended on controlling not just the present, but the story of the past. Better to keep them hidden, sealed away where they could do no harm. The Vatican itself has never admitted to holding such manuscripts, but silence is its most powerful answer. By neither confirming nor denying, it keeps the mystery alive and its control unchallenged. Researchers are left with rumours, tantalising hints, and the knowledge that the archives stretch more than 50 kilometres underground. Somewhere in those endless shelves may rest papyrus scrolls written by Egyptian priests thousands of years ago. If they do exist, then the Vatican has not only preserved the history of Christianity, but also stolen fragments of Egypt's sacred memory, rewriting the story of civilization while keeping the original pages locked forever in the dark. In the temples of Egypt, priests stood in chambers, filled with incense, chanting invocations in voices meant to shake the air itself. They called on gods to drive away spirits, to heal the sick, or to guard the dead on their journey to the afterlife. These were not just words. They were believed to be weapons, a force that bound unseen powers to obey. Centuries later in Rome, when Christianity had risen to power, strangely similar words began to echo inside churches. Exorcisms, blessings, and liturgies carried rhythms and tones that felt ancient, as if the Nile still spoke through the Latin tongue. The forbidden rituals of Egypt had not been erased, they had been adapted. Egyptian invocations always followed a pattern. The priest would summon by name, declare authority, and command obedience. The words were repeated in sequences, often with sacred numbers, and accompanied by gestures or the display of ritual objects. If one reads the oldest Christian exorcisms preserved in Latin texts, the same structure appears. The priest names the demon, calls on divine power, repeats the command 3 times, and seals it with the sign of the cross. The gods have changed, but the method remains. The Church claimed its authority came directly from Christ, yet the framework of its most powerful prayers carries the fingerprints of the Egyptian temple. Even the language itself holds clues. Latin exorcisms are filled with phrases of binding, adjuring, and commanding spirits to depart. These mirror the older Egyptian spells that ordered spirits to leave the body or depart from the tomb. Where Egyptian priests once invoked Ra or Osiris, Christian clerics invoked Christ or the Trinity. But the technique of channeling divine authority into words to expel the unwanted is nearly identical. The idea that sound itself has creative and destructive power is as Egyptian as the hieroglyphs carved into stone. Liturgy too shows this continuity. The chanting of psalms in long rhythmic tones echoes the recitation of hymns to the gods in Egyptian temples. The use of incense, bells, and processions in the Vatican recalls the ceremonies once held for Isis and Horus. Even the elevation of sacred objects during Mass resembles the presentation of amulets and statues before the people. It is as though the forms of worship were too deeply carved into human memory to vanish, so the Church baptized them in new names and continued them under its own authority. Why would the Vatican preserve such methods if they came from a religion it condemned as pagan? Perhaps because they worked. Rituals that gave people a sense of protection and awe could not simply be thrown away. By translating invocations into Latin and branding them as Christian, the Church could inherit the ancient authority of Egypt while disguising its origins. To the faithful, it looked like divine power. To the careful observer, it looks like echoes of the Nile carried into the heart of Rome. What was once forbidden became sacred, and the rituals of pharaohs now live on in the prayers of priests. In the shadowed halls of medieval monasteries, monks copied scriptures by candlelight, their pens scratching across parchment in silence. To the outside world, these men lived only for prayer and devotion. But hidden behind the stone walls, another kind of work quietly survived, a science older than the monasteries themselves. It was alchemy, the secret descendant of Egyptian chemistry, preserved not in public schools or royal courts, but in cloisters where knowledge could be hidden under the guise of sacred study. The legacy of Egypt's laboratories lived on through ink, fire, and secrecy. The Egyptians had long practiced the art of transforming matter. In their temples and workshops, they developed dyes, medicines, glasswork, and even processes for refining metals. They called it the sacred chemistry of creation, a way of mirroring the gods who turned chaos into order. When Greek scholars encountered this tradition in Alexandria, they translated it into writings that would later be known as alchemical texts. By the time Christianity spread, these writings had already mingled with philosophy, astrology, and mysticism. Though condemned by many church leaders as dangerous, the manuscripts were too valuable to destroy. Instead, they were hidden, studied, and sometimes rewritten in Latin. During the Middle Ages, open talk of alchemy could lead to charges of heresy. Yet within monasteries, monks experimented quietly. Records show them distilling herbs into tinctures, combining minerals into powders, and searching for universal solvents that could purify both matter and spirit. They spoke in coded language, using symbols of dragons, suns, and serpents to disguise practical recipes. The famous quest to turn lead into gold may have been only one layer of the work. Beneath it lay the older Egyptian idea that transformation of matter reflected transformation of the soul. To purify metals was to mirror the purification of man. Some of the greatest alchemical manuscripts were preserved directly by church scholars. The works of Zosimos of Panopolis, a 3rd century Egyptian alchemist, were copied and studied in Byzantine and later Vatican collections. His descriptions of furnaces, vessels, and the spiritual symbolism of fire were read by monks who claimed to be doing nothing more than studying creation. In truth, they were keeping alive a branch of Egyptian science disguised as Christian meditation. Without these quiet custodians, the chain of alchemical knowledge might have snapped forever. By the Renaissance, alchemy burst back into the open, inspiring philosophers and scientists who pushed Europe into new discoveries. But its roots had never died. They had been preserved in cloisters, where monks blended prayer with experiment, scripture with fire, devotion with curiosity. The Vatican may have condemned public alchemists, but its own libraries held the very manuscripts that carried Egypt's chemistry into the medieval world. The survival of alchemy proves that knowledge, once born, refuses to vanish. It hides, it waits, and sometimes it disguises itself in robes until the world is ready to see it again. In this way, the cloisters became Egypt's secret laboratories, and the church its unknowing guardian. Long before Christianity rose in Rome, the Egyptians told the story of Osiris, a god who was betrayed, killed, and torn apart, only to be brought back to life through the devotion of his wife Isis. From his resurrection came Horus, the child who would avenge his father and carry on his divine rule. This myth was not a small tale. It was the backbone of Egyptian religion, teaching that death was not the end and that eternal life awaited those who followed the path of Osiris. Centuries later, when Christianity began to spread, its central promise rested on a remarkably similar idea, that through the death and resurrection of Christ, humanity could overcome death and rise into eternity. To many, the parallels are more than coincidence. They suggest that Christian theology absorbed the ancient resurrection motif, already deeply rooted in the imagination of the Nile. The myth of Osiris was more than legend. Every year, Egyptians reenacted it through rituals tied to the flooding of the Nile, the death of crops, and their rebirth. Osiris became the symbol of life's eternal cycle, a god who had conquered death and thus could guide humans through it as well. Priests taught that the dead could become like Osiris if they were properly buried, recited the right words, and were judged worthy. In tomb art, the deceased is often shown merging with Osiris, wearing his crown and standing as a reborn being. Eternal life was not only possible, it was guaranteed through the pattern of Osiris's story. When early Christians preached the resurrection of Christ, they used language and imagery that would have sounded familiar in Egypt. The tomb, the mourning followers, the rising to new life, all echoed the Osiris cycle. The idea that believers would share in this resurrection mirrors the Egyptian belief that followers of Osiris would rise as he did. Even the symbol of the cross, representing life after death, carries the same promise that Osiris once embodied. The Church presented Christ's resurrection as a unique miracle, yet the concept of a dying and rising figure had already been alive for centuries along the Nile. The Vatican may not openly acknowledge these connections, but its rituals continue the pattern. The Easter liturgy, with its mourning on Good Friday, followed by celebration on Easter Sunday, mirrors the rhythm of death and rebirth celebrated for Osiris each year. The bread and wine of communion, symbolizing life renewed, recall the Egyptian rituals where grain and water were blessed in honor of Osiris's renewal of the land. The theological message is clear in both traditions. Death is not an end, but a passage, and the faithful need only follow the one who conquered it first. The story of Osiris shaped Egyptian civilization for millennia, and through Christianity, it continues to shape the world today. Christ and Osiris are not the same, but the echoes between them are undeniable. Both stand as bridges across the chasm of death, promising their followers that life continues beyond the grave. Whether borrowed, adapted, or rediscovered, the resurrection motif proves that some truths are too powerful to vanish. Travelling across time from the pyramids to the Vatican, still offering the same eternal hope. The Egyptians were among the first to map the heavens with precision, charting the cycles of stars and planets, not only to guide their agriculture, but also to shape their religion. For them, the sky was a temple where gods moved across the night, and each constellation carried messages for the living. They divided the year into 12 parts, aligned temples with solstices, and recorded the heliacal rising of Sirius to predict the flooding of the Nile. Their priests were not only guardians of rituals, but also astronomers, reading the stars as signs of divine order. Centuries later, in the very heart of the Vatican, clerics consulted star maps and calculated celestial movements with the same reverence, continuing a tradition rooted in Egypt, even while condemning astrology in public. When Christianity first grew, the official stance was suspicious of astrology. The idea that stars could influence human fate seemed to threaten the authority of God. Yet, behind closed doors, bishops and popes allowed astrologers to whisper their predictions. Many of those predictions drew directly from Egyptian methods carried through Greek and Roman texts. The Vatican inherited not only scripture, but also fragments of the astronomical wisdom of Alexandria, where Egyptian priests had once blended observation with myth. The result was a secret dependence on star lore, even as sermons denounced it. Medieval manuscripts, preserved in church libraries, reveal the depth of this connection. Diagrams of constellations, planetary tables, and zodiac charts were copied by monks who claimed they were studying creation as God's handiwork. But the roots of these images trace back to the ceilings of Egyptian tombs, where star maps were painted to guide the soul in the afterlife. The very zodiac that decorated European cathedrals originated in Egypt, carried through translations, and adapted into Latin. When Vatican clerics consulted these charts to choose coronations, election dates, or even battles, they were echoing the work of Egyptian priests who had once guided pharaohs with the same calculations. The Vatican Observatory itself, founded in the 16th century, is often described as a sign of the Church's openness to science. Yet even this modern institution owes a debt to Egypt. Its focus on equinoxes, solstices, and planetary cycles mirrors the alignments the Egyptians mastered thousands of years earlier. To track Easter, the most sacred feast, the Vatican must still rely on the spring equinox, a calculation first fixed by Egyptian star watchers who understood the rhythm of the heavens. The Church may cloak this in theological language, but the bones of the practice are Egyptian. The irony is sharp. Publicly, astrology was branded as superstition, forbidden to the faithful. Privately, the Vatican preserved and used it, knowing that the stars hold patterns too powerful to ignore. This duality, condemnation on the surface and reliance in secret, mirrors the way the Church has handled much of Egypt's wisdom. The constellations above Rome still trace the same paths that guided the Nile, and within the Vatican's walls, those paths were studied, recorded, and quietly used to shape decisions. Egypt's astrology never died. It was baptized in Latin and hidden behind the robes of clerics, who knew the heavens speak a language older than any creed. In the first centuries after Christ, the Christian faith was not yet the towering institution it would later become. It was a scattered movement, filled with debates and rival teachings, a world of competing ideas about God, creation, and the soul. Some of these early voices drew heavily on Egyptian wisdom, blending the new faith with echoes of the Nile. But as the church gained power, it began to silence them, branding them heretics and erasing their influence. To question official doctrine was to risk not only exile, but disappearance from history itself. One of the earliest of these silenced figures was Origen of Alexandria, a scholar in the 3rd century who believed in the pre-existence of souls and the possibility that all creation would eventually be restored to God. His ideas carried the flavour of Egyptian thought, where life was seen as a cycle of death and rebirth, and the soul's journey spanned beyond a single lifetime. Though he was admired for his brilliance, centuries later, church councils condemned his writings. Many of his works were burned, and his Egyptian-influenced theology was stamped as dangerous. Yet fragments of his teaching survived, hidden in manuscripts. The Vatican still keeps locked away. Another figure was Valentinus, a teacher in Rome during the 2nd century, who wove Egyptian and Greek philosophy into his vision of Christianity. He spoke of hidden knowledge, a gnosis, that could free the soul from the material world. This idea reflected the Egyptian belief that secret wisdom held the key to eternal life. His followers, called Gnostics, spread quickly across the empire. But their texts were outlawed, their communities crushed, and their works vanished into the deserts of Egypt, where they remained buried until the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in the 20th century. These texts, many of them influenced by Egyptian mysticism, showed just how much was lost when the church silenced its rivals. Even the worship of Mary, though it became central to Catholicism, was at first seen by some as suspiciously close to the cult of Isis. Scholars who noted the similarities were accused of undermining the uniqueness of Christianity. Rather than admit the influence, the church chose to erase the connection, branding anyone who mentioned it as a threat to the faith. In this way, Egyptian echoes were hidden beneath layers of silence. The Vatican's role in this silencing was not only theological but political. By condemning those who drew on Egyptian ideas, it ensured that its own version of history became the only one remembered. Heretics were not merely wrong, they were erased. Their writings disappeared, their names forgotten, their influence buried under centuries of official doctrine. But every now and then, fragments resurface, reminding us that Christianity's early centuries were far more diverse than the story told in textbooks. And in those fragments, one can still hear the voice of Egypt, speaking through scholars who were silenced but never fully erased. Their ideas prove that beneath the surface of the Vatican's carefully guarded faith lies a hidden stream of knowledge flowing from the Nile itself. When most people think of the Jesuits, they imagine missionaries travelling across the world, schools training generations of students, or advisors whispering into the ears of kings. But hidden in their long history is another role, one rarely spoken of but deeply important. The Jesuits were among the first to take an unusual interest in Egypt, not only as a land of ancient ruins but as a source of knowledge that might reshape the understanding of history itself. In their missions, writings, and collections, they preserved fragments of a civilization that others ignored or destroyed. Some even whisper that it was the Jesuits who quietly carried Egyptian relics and manuscripts into the guarded vaults of the Vatican. In the 16th century, Europe was awakening to exploration. Scholars began to speak of Egypt as more than a biblical backdrop. It was seen as the cradle of wisdom, a place whose monuments hinted at secrets long forgotten. The Jesuits, with their combination of scholarship and loyalty to the Church, became natural agents for gathering this knowledge. Their missionaries, stationed in the Middle East, often sent reports back to Rome describing ruins, temples, and strange inscriptions carved into stone. These letters did not circulate widely. They were filed, studied, and in some cases hidden. The Jesuits were fascinated by hieroglyphs. Long before Champollion cracked the Rosetta Stone in the 19th century, Jesuit scholars were attempting to decipher the symbols. Some believed the writing contained divine secrets passed down from the age of Noah. Others thought it hid the original language of Adam. They copied inscriptions, collected papyri, and speculated endlessly about their meanings. Though many of their translations were wrong, the very act of preserving these symbols ensured that the memory of Egyptian writing survived when others dismissed it as decoration. Their role as collectors was equally significant. Jesuit explorers in the 17th and 18th centuries are said to have purchased or taken relics from Egyptian tombs, shipping them quietly to Rome. Unlike ordinary travelers who sold such items for profit, the Jesuits placed them in private collections under church control. Some of these artifacts were displayed, but many disappeared into the Vatican's archives. The suspicion remains that the Jesuits acted as the Vatican's field agents, gathering Egypt's forgotten treasures and funneling them into the hands of clerics who understood their importance. At the same time, the Jesuits published works on Egypt that shaped European thought. Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar in the 17th century, became one of the most famous interpreters of hieroglyphs. Though his translations were later proved inaccurate, his books filled with detailed illustrations kept Egypt alive in the imagination of Europe. He wrote of pyramids, obelisks, and ancient rituals, presenting Egypt as a land of hidden wisdom. His writings influenced not only scholars but also secret societies who believed Egypt held the key to lost knowledge. The Jesuits served the Vatican with loyalty, but their curiosity about Egypt was more than simple scholarship. They acted as bridges between two worlds, preserving fragments of a civilization that the Church both feared and admired. Through their hands, relics, manuscripts, and ideas travelled across deserts and seas into Rome. And while they preached obedience and faith, they also kept alive the memory of Egypt's mysteries, ensuring that the Nile continued to flow beneath the surface of the Vatican's power. There is a theory whispered among historians and seekers of hidden truths that in the earliest centuries of Christianity, a pact was made, not written on parchment for all to see, but sealed in silence among those who wore the papal crown. This pact, according to the theory, was to guard the fragments of Egyptian power that had come into their possession. The Church would not destroy this knowledge, for it was too precious, too potent to be erased, but neither would it be allowed to spread among the faithful. It would be concealed, kept under lock and key, passed quietly from one pope to the next like a dangerous inheritance. In this way, the Vatican would inherit not only the keys of heaven, but also the secrets of Egypt, wielding two sources of authority while pretending to hold only one. The idea of such a pact emerges when you look at the strange contradictions of history. Christianity denounced paganism, yet so much of Egyptian symbolism appears within the Church. Obelisks rise in St. Peter's Square. Hieroglyphs decorate medieval manuscripts. Egyptian motifs are woven into papal tombs and rituals. It seems unlikely this is mere coincidence. Instead, it looks like absorption, as if the Church chose to cloak Egyptian wisdom rather than erase it. For that to happen, there had to be a decision, a choice made by leaders who understood what they were inheriting and agreed to maintain it in silence. Consider the early centuries after the fall of Rome. The Church was fragile, often under attack, yet it rose with remarkable resilience. Some suggest this strength came not only from faith, but from knowledge quietly borrowed from Egypt, knowledge about symbols, rituals, and the psychology of power. By mastering these tools, the popes built an authority that mirrored the pharaohs. But to admit such borrowing would have been dangerous. Christianity claimed to be a new revelation, the true light of God. If people knew it leaned on Egyptian wisdom, the illusion of uniqueness would collapse, and so silence became policy. The pact was not written but lived, generation after generation. The archives of the Vatican may hold the strongest evidence. For centuries, popes have forbidden full access to its deepest vaults, where rumours say Egyptian papyri, relics, and texts are preserved. Why keep them if they serve no purpose? Why not destroy them as heretical? The answer may be that these popes recognized their power and chose to safeguard it for themselves. To destroy would mean to lose control. To preserve meant to hold a hidden weapon, a reserve of ancient authority that could be drawn upon when needed. This pact of silence explains why Egyptian echoes still pulse beneath the surface of Christian tradition. It was not an accident, but a decision, one made in the shadows of history. The Church would carry Egypt's torch, but it would never admit to lighting its flame from that source. Whether this pact was formal or instinctive, its effect is the same. The Vatican became the keeper of two traditions, one public and one hidden, and the silence that guards the second remains unbroken to this day. The way we measure time feels natural, as though the calendar has always been as it is now. But the truth is far stranger. The very system that governs our days and seasons has been shaped and reshaped by human hands, and at the heart of this story stands Egypt. The Egyptians created one of the most precise calendars of the ancient world, tied to the rhythms of the Nile and the rising of the star Sirius. Their year of 365 days divided into 12 months of 30 days, each with 5 extra days for the gods, became the model that influenced both Rome and later the Vatican. When the Church reformed its calendar in the 16th century, it was unknowingly repeating a pattern first drawn on the banks of the Nile thousands of years earlier. The Egyptian priests did not invent their calendar by accident. They were careful observers of the sky, tracking the cycles of the sun and the stars with patience across generations. They noticed that when Sirius rose at dawn, the floods of the Nile followed, bringing life to the land. This connection between heaven and earth gave them a cosmic clock more reliable than any human invention. The calendar they built was so accurate that even the Romans, with all their power, borrowed from it when they adjusted their own timekeeping. Julius Caesar introduced the Julian calendar in 45 BC, a system directly influenced by Egypt. It fixed the year at 365 1/4 days, the same cycle Egyptian astronomers had already mastered. Centuries later, the Vatican faced a problem. The Julian calendar had drifted. Easter, the most sacred feast of Christianity, was no longer aligning with the spring equinox. To restore order, Pope Gregory XIII announced a reform in 1582. 10 days were dropped from October that year, and leap year rules were changed to keep time aligned with the heavens. This became the Gregorian calendar, the very system most of the world still uses today. But behind the reform lies the shadow of Egypt. The Vatican was not inventing time anew, it was correcting it with methods rooted in the same observations Egyptian priests had used millennia earlier. Even the way the Church tied its rituals to the sky echoes Egyptian tradition. The Egyptians built temples aligned with solstices and equinoxes. The Vatican fixed Easter to the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. Both systems show the same truth, that religion depends on cosmic time, and the calendar becomes the bridge between heaven and earth. To control time is to control worship, harvests, and memory itself. The irony is that while the Church condemned astrology as superstition, it built its most sacred calendar reforms on the foundation of Egyptian star watching. The priests of the Nile turned the cosmos into a clock, and centuries later the Vatican refined it to govern the Christian world. In this way, Egypt still beats at the heart of every date we write, every holiday we celebrate, and every rhythm of time we take for granted. In the Middle Ages, stories of miracles spread across Europe like wildfire. Churches whispered of statues that wept, relics that glowed, and saints who performed impossible feats. To the faithful, these wonders were proof of divine power. But what if some of them were not miracles at all, but echoes of Egyptian engineering disguised as holy marvels? The Egyptians were masters of mechanics, hydraulics, and hidden devices. In their temples they built doors that opened by themselves, statues that spoke with hidden tubes, and sacred pools that appeared to fill by the hand of the gods. These tricks were not magic, but technology designed to awe. When similar marvels appeared in medieval cathedrals, was it truly heaven breaking through, or was it ancient knowledge re-emerging under new names? Accounts survive of altars that lit themselves, lamps that burned without oil, and crucifixes that moved as if alive. Monks and priests declared them miracles, proof of divine presence. Yet, the same kinds of devices were described by Hero of Alexandria, an engineer who lived in the 1st century and inherited Egyptian mechanical traditions. He wrote of steam-powered machines, water organs, and automata that could move on their own. Many of his writings were preserved in Greek and later Latin manuscripts kept by church scholars. This means the knowledge was available, though hidden from the general population. If a medieval priest installed such a device in his church and declared it a miracle, who would dare to question him? The Vatican had every reason to encourage these wonders. A people who believed in miracles would trust the church without doubt, and if the secrets behind them came from Egypt, that was a truth best left unspoken. Better to let the faithful think a saint had intervened than admit the knowledge had roots in a pagan civilization long condemned as idolatrous. This silence would have transformed Egyptian mechanics into Christian marvels, reshaping science into faith. One striking example is the use of obelisks in Rome. When these towering stones were raised in the Renaissance, the feats of engineering required were immense. Yet official accounts often spoke of divine blessing guiding the process, as though human knowledge played no role. The Egyptians had mastered the art of moving colossal stones thousands of years earlier. Their methods, partially preserved in hidden manuscripts, may have been applied in secret while the public was told to believe in miracles. The result was the same: awe, obedience, and power for the institution that claimed divine authority. If Egyptian devices and techniques did survive into the Middle Ages, they would have been tightly controlled. To admit they were mechanical would weaken the aura of divine mystery. To call them miracles gave them ultimate power. And so engineering was disguised as faith. Machines became holy wonders, and the echoes of Egypt were hidden in plain sight. Perhaps some of the greatest medieval miracles were not acts of heaven at all, but the hands of forgotten Egyptian engineers, reaching across time, their knowledge baptized in Latin and presented as proof of God's will. Throughout history, the Vatican has canonized thousands of saints, men and women held up as models of holiness. Their stories often describe visions, miracles, and wisdom that seemed far beyond the ordinary. But there is a theory that some of these saints may not have been purely Christian figures at all. Instead, they may have been rebranded Egyptian initiates, scribes and priests, whose ancient knowledge was too valuable to lose and too dangerous to admit openly. Rather than erase them entirely, the Church may have reshaped their identities, baptizing them as saints so their wisdom could be preserved under new names. Egyptian priests were guardians of medicine, astronomy, and sacred ritual. They studied the stars, practiced healing arts, and guarded the mysteries of life and death. Their role was not so different from that of later monks and clerics. When Christianity spread across Egypt in the early centuries, many of these priests either vanished or were absorbed into the new faith. It is possible that their teachings did not die, but were wrapped in Christian language, and their memory preserved in stories of saints who seemed almost superhuman in their knowledge. Some saints credited with miraculous healing bear striking resemblances to Egyptian physicians. Their cures often involved herbs, oils, and methods that match ancient medical practices described on Egyptian papyri. To the faithful, these cures were miracles. To the historian, they look like fragments of older science, reborn under a new identity. Other saints, linked to visions of the stars or divine light, may in fact echo the astronomer priests who mapped the heavens and tied rituals to the rising of Sirius or the solstices. Their cosmic awareness, once called pagan wisdom, could easily have been retold as Christian revelation. Even the imagery of some saints recalls Egyptian archetypes. Stories of figures who are killed, dismembered, and restored to life echo the myth of Osiris. Female saints associated with divine motherhood mirror Isis, who nursed Horus and was worshipped across the Roman Empire. The similarities are close enough to suggest that the transition from priest to saint was less a matter of forgetting and more a matter of renaming. The Church may have decided it was easier to absorb than to destroy. By canonizing figures who carried Egyptian wisdom, it preserved fragments of the past while keeping control of the narrative. The Vatican's silence around these parallels is telling. Officially, saints are unique Christian witnesses. But in the patterns of their stories lie older echoes, whispers of scribes, and initiates whose teachings once shaped Egypt. To the faithful, this connection might seem impossible, yet history shows that the Church has often rebranded what it could not erase. In this sense, saints may have been more than holy figures. They may have been the last guardians of Egypt, remembered not by their true names, but by titles acceptable to Christian ears. And in the glow of their halos, one might still see the shadow of the Nile. Beneath the marble floors of the Vatican lie crypts and tunnels where popes, cardinals and saints have been buried for centuries. Pilgrims visit the famous necropolis beneath St. Peter's Basilica, believing it to be the resting place of the first pope himself. Yet rumours persist that deeper still, beyond the known chambers, there may be tombs holding relics not of Christian origin, but of Egypt. Some whisper that fragments of sarcophagi, papyri, and statues brought from the Nile during the early centuries of Rome were hidden away under layers of stone. If true, the Vatican is not only the guardian of Christian memory, but also the secret tomb keeper of Egypt's forgotten treasures. The link between Rome and Egypt was strong long before the Church existed. Emperors filled the city with obelisks, sphinxes, and Egyptian statues looted from the Nile. Many of these were placed in temples, gardens, and forums, reminders of Rome's conquest, but also of its admiration. When Christianity rose and the old temples were destroyed or transformed, what happened to these relics? Some were displayed openly, baptized with new meaning, but others may have been considered too dangerous, too obviously tied to the old gods. It is here that speculation begins. Rather than destroy them, clerics may have carried them into underground vaults, sealing them away in the very heart of Rome. Archaeologists who have worked beneath the Vatican speak of blocked passages and sealed chambers that no one is allowed to enter. Some describe walls that appear newer than the surrounding stone, as if built to cover older structures. Could these be the hidden tombs? Legends claim that Egyptian coffins, once taken to Rome, still rest there, unopened and unseen, guarded as much by silence as by stone. If these tombs exist, they would contain not only artifacts but knowledge, for the Egyptians buried their dead with scrolls, inscriptions, and objects meant to guide them in the afterlife. Imagine such relics lying just beneath the Vatican's foundations, closer to the Nile than to the Tiber in spirit. The Vatican has never admitted to possessing such tombs, yet its pattern of secrecy fuels suspicion. Why are so many areas of the necropolis closed to the public? Why do official guides carefully steer visitors away from certain sections? Why does every request for full exploration end in denial? The answer may be simple. To reveal Egyptian relics beneath Rome would shatter the narrative of the Vatican as purely Christian ground. It would show that even the very stones of its foundation carry the weight of older gods. Whether fact or legend, the idea of hidden tombs under Rome captures the imagination because it suggests a history layered like the earth itself. Christianity on the surface, Egypt in the depths. Perhaps one day a sealed door will open, and the light will fall on relics that have not been seen since the time of the Pharaohs. Until then, the silence of the crypts speaks louder than any sermon. If Egypt's treasures do lie beneath the Vatican, then the city of Rome stands not only as the centre of Catholic faith, but also as the final resting place of secrets carried across the desert sands of the Nile. The Renaissance is often described as a sudden burst of light after 1,000 years of darkness. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe seemed to awaken with new art, science, and philosophy. Scholars claimed they had rediscovered the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome, texts thought to be lost, but suddenly reappearing. Yet behind this story lies a troubling question. Were these discoveries truly accidental, or had the knowledge been hidden all along, carefully preserved and released at the right moment? And if so, who controlled its release? Many signs point back to the Vatican, and behind the Vatican, to Egypt. During the Renaissance, scholars marvelled at works attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a figure said to be part Greek and part Egyptian, often linked to the god Thoth. These writings, collected as the Corpus Hermeticum, contained ideas about the cosmos, the divine spark within man, and the hidden unity of all things. When they were translated into Latin in the 15th century, they caused a sensation. Thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno drew inspiration from them, believing they had uncovered the oldest wisdom of humanity. But where had these texts been for more than 1,000 years? Some suggest they had never truly vanished, but rested in the vaults of monasteries guarded by clerics who knew their power. If that is true, then the Renaissance was not a rediscovery but a release, staged by those who decided the time had come. The art of the period also bears Egyptian marks. Painters filled their works with symbols of suns, eyes, and hidden geometry. Architects revived the obelisk, raising it again in Roman plazas with papal blessing. Even the idea of man as a divine being, capable of transcending limits, echoes Egyptian teachings of the soul's eternal journey. These were not coincidences. They were signs that fragments of the Nile's wisdom had resurfaced, dressed in Renaissance clothing but carrying the same ancient pulse. Why would the Vatican allow this release? By the late Middle Ages, its authority was under pressure. Heresies, political struggles, and corruption scandals threatened its image. By unveiling pieces of ancient wisdom, the Church could present itself as the guardian of knowledge, the one who had kept the light alive through the Dark Ages. It could claim credit for humanity's awakening, even if it had been the one to dim the flame in the first place. This strategy turned Egypt's wisdom into a tool of Catholic prestige, a way to strengthen the Church while appearing generous. The question that remains is whether the Renaissance truly marked a new beginning, or whether it was simply the next act in a performance scripted long before. If Egyptian wisdom was hidden by the Vatican and then released in measured doses, then the story of human progress is less about rediscovery and more about control. Knowledge was never truly lost. It was locked away, waiting. And when the Renaissance dawned, it was not an accident of fate, but the turning of a key that had always been in the Vatican's hands. A key that had first been forged on the banks of the Nile. When Napoleon marched into Egypt in the year 1798, he claimed his goal was conquest. But behind the roar of cannons and the clash of swords, another mission quietly unfolded. He had brought with him not only soldiers, but an army of scholars, engineers, and artists, men tasked with documenting every monument, inscription, and artifact they could find. This campaign produced discoveries that stunned Europe, from towering ruins buried in sand to the mysterious Rosetta Stone. While the world saw military glory, the Vatican saw something else, a chance to reclaim fragments of Egyptian knowledge that it had long suspected still waited beneath the desert. Though the Church spoke little of Napoleon's expedition, its quiet interest ran deep. The scholars Napoleon assembled produced the monumental description of Egypt, a vast series of volumes filled with detailed drawings and accounts of temples, hieroglyphs, and statues. This was the first time Europe saw Egypt in such vivid detail. Yet even before these works were published, rumours spread that certain findings did not reach the public. Some objects vanished into private collections, others were claimed by governments, and some, whisperers say, found their way to Rome, carried in secret to the Vatican's archives, where they joined older relics already hidden there. If true, then Napoleon's campaign was not just a moment of discovery, but also a moment of transfer, feeding the Church's appetite for Egypt's secrets. One of the greatest treasures uncovered was the Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799. It contained a decree written in 3 scripts, including hieroglyphs, and would later provide the key to deciphering Egypt's lost language. The stone eventually went to Britain, displayed proudly in the British Museum, yet the Vatican had its own scholars working from copies of the inscriptions. Priests trained in ancient languages studied the texts, eager to unlock what had once been the exclusive knowledge of Egyptian priests. For the Vatican, the Rosetta Stone was not only an artifact, but a doorway into forgotten wisdom that could challenge or enrich their guarded traditions. The Church's silence during this period is telling. While newspapers and academies across Europe debated the meaning of Napoleon's finds, the Vatican issued no grand statements. But silence does not mean indifference. Silence often means possession, a careful watching from the shadows. Jesuit scholars in particular are said to have gained access to some of Napoleon's collected manuscripts, bringing them quietly back to Rome for study. Official history does not record this, but the pattern fits. Whenever Egypt's secrets surface, somehow they end up near the Vatican's locked shelves. Napoleon's campaign may have been a military failure, but its cultural impact changed the world. It awakened a craze for Egypt, a wave of fascination called Egyptomania that swept through Europe. For the Vatican, this was both an opportunity and a threat. On one hand, the discoveries confirmed what it had long preserved in silence. On the other hand, the spread of Egyptian knowledge risked exposing too much. By keeping its voice quiet, the Church maintained control, letting others marvel while it continued to guard what it already knew. In this way, Napoleon's campaign was less a revelation than a reminder that the sands of Egypt still concealed treasures, and that the Vatican's eyes were always watching, ready to collect what the desert gave back. In the year 1822, Jean-François Champollion stunned the world when he announced he had cracked the code of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Using the Rosetta Stone as his guide, he unlocked a language that had been silent for nearly 2,000 years. Suddenly, the walls of temples and tombs were no longer mute stone, but voices speaking across time. For scholars, this was a triumph, a doorway into the ancient mind. But for the Vatican, it was a moment of unease. If the hieroglyphs could now be read, then secrets long buried might surface, secrets the Church had carefully guarded or quietly absorbed. The Vatican's response was not celebration, but resistance, a subtle attempt to control what could be revealed and how it would be understood. For centuries, the Church had enjoyed the privilege of being one of the few institutions with access to ancient manuscripts. Monks copied texts filled with mysterious symbols, and Jesuit scholars speculated on their meanings. Though they often misinterpreted them, their mistakes still served a purpose. So long as hieroglyphs remained unreadable, the Church could define them as it pleased, branding them as mystical, allegorical, or even prophetic. Champollion's breakthrough threatened to strip away that control. It replaced speculation with science, giving ordinary scholars the power to interpret Egypt without clerical approval. That loss of monopoly was something the Vatican could not welcome. At first, the Church ignored Champollion, dismissing his work as unimportant. But as his translations spread, resistance grew. Clerical writers argued that hieroglyphs were never meant to be read as a literal language, but only as symbols pointing to spiritual truths. To admit otherwise would mean accepting that the Egyptians had a sophisticated writing system that preserved history, medicine, astronomy, and ritual in detail. Such knowledge, once unlocked, could expose uncomfortable parallels between Egypt and Christianity, from resurrection myths to cosmic calendars. Better to cast doubt on Champollion than risk the faithful asking too many questions. There are stories of Vatican scholars gaining access to early drafts of Champollion's work, not to support him, but to monitor what he was revealing. Some claim that copies of translations quietly disappeared, acquired by clerics who did not want certain phrases or rituals entering public debate. The silence of the Vatican archives during this period is striking. They held Egyptian papyri brought to Rome centuries earlier. texts that could have confirmed or challenged Champolion's findings. Yet they remained sealed, their knowledge withheld, as if to keep the balance of power intact. Champollion himself faced opposition until his death in 1832. Though his legacy survived, the hesitation of religious authorities slowed the full acceptance of his discoveries. Even today, questions remain about what hieroglyphic texts are still hidden in the Vatican's vaults, untranslated, unseen, and possibly contradicting the narrative of history the Church prefers. The story of decoding hieroglyphs is not just about a brilliant Frenchman unlocking a code. It is also about an ancient struggle over knowledge. For the Vatican, the cracking of the hieroglyphs was not a triumph but a threat, because once the stones began to speak, they might tell a story very different from the one preached beneath the dome of St. Peter's. Tucked away inside the Vatican museums is a section that few visitors truly notice, the Gregorian Egyptian Museum. Founded in 1839 by Pope Gregory XVI, it houses one of the most important collections of Egyptian artifacts in Europe. To the public, it looks like just another display of ancient relics, statues, and mummies. But the truth runs deeper. Many scholars believe this museum is only the surface of something far greater, a carefully curated glimpse of a much larger hidden collection owned by the popes themselves. What the world sees are fragments. What remains behind locked doors may be the real treasure, a secret archive of Egypt preserved in the heart of Rome. The museum's official halls contain sarcophagi, hieroglyph-covered steles, papyri, and amulets, all displayed with the neutral air of history. Yet even these open exhibits are unusual. Why would the Vatican, the seat of Christianity, devote so much space to the religion of pharaohs, a system it once condemned as pagan and idolatrous? The answer may be that the popes have always had a quiet fascination with Egypt, collecting its relics not as curiosities, but as keys to a forgotten current of power. By placing some items in the museum, they offer the appearance of transparency, but by withholding others, they keep control of the deeper narrative. Travelers and researchers who have glimpsed the private sections of the collection tell strange stories. Shelves lined with scrolls that are never shown. Statues of gods with jackal heads or falcon crowns hidden from the casual visitor. Boxes marked with ancient symbols sealed in storerooms where only clerics may enter. There are rumours that papyri describing rituals of Thoth and Isis exist within these walls, untranslated and deliberately excluded from exhibitions. If true, then the Vatican is not merely preserving history, but actively curating what the world is allowed to know about Egypt. The creation of the museum itself may have been a strategy. By displaying some artifacts, the Vatican could claim openness while keeping the majority of its collection in private vaults. This tactic has worked for centuries. Tourists leave impressed, believing they have seen everything. Scholars accept the limits placed on them. Meanwhile, the true heart of the Egyptian collection remains untouched, possibly extending into the deeper archive network beneath the Vatican. 50 kilometers of shelving is said to lie under the city, and no one knows how many Egyptian relics might rest there in silence. The Egyptian Museum of the Popes is therefore both a window and a mask. It reveals enough to spark curiosity, but hides enough to protect secrets. Every sarcophagus on display may have a twin locked away. Every papyrus scroll, visible behind glass, may be one of dozens kept in the dark. The Vatican presents Egypt as a relic of the past, while quietly keeping alive the possibility that within those relics lies knowledge too dangerous to release. And so as pilgrims and tourists wander through the museum's polished halls, they may not realize that the real Egyptian Museum of the Popes is not the one they can see, but the one they will never be allowed to enter. In the winter of 1945, a discovery in the Egyptian desert shook the foundations of biblical history. Near the village of Nag Hammadi, a farmer uncovered a sealed jar containing 13 leather-bound codices. Inside were more than 50 texts, now known as the Nag Hammadi Library. These writings included gospels, hymns, and philosophical reflections that had been hidden for more than 1,500 years. To the outside world, they looked like forgotten Christian scriptures, but a closer reading reveals something deeper. Many of these texts echo ancient Egyptian cosmology, blending the language of early Christianity with the imagery of pharaohs, gods, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. The Gospel of Thomas, one of the most famous texts from the find, presents Jesus not as a distant saviour, but as a teacher of hidden wisdom. His sayings encourage seekers to look within, to find the divine spark already inside them. This teaching resonates strongly with Egyptian ideas of the soul, the Ka and Ba, which were seen as fragments of divine energy living within each person. Instead of demanding blind faith, these Gospels suggest an awakening of the self, a theme strikingly close to Egyptian initiation rituals where knowledge of the self was the key to eternal life. Other texts describe a layered universe filled with realms of light and shadow, overseen by beings who govern creation. This cosmic map resembles the Egyptian vision of the afterlife, where the soul travels through different halls and gates before reaching union with the divine. Even the descriptions of hostile rulers or archons in the Nag Hammadi writings recall the Egyptian guardians of the underworld who tested and challenged the soul. To see these parallels is to realize that Christianity in Egypt did not emerge in isolation. It grew in the shadow of the Nile, drawing on imagery and concepts that had shaped the land for thousands of years. For the Vatican, these discoveries were troubling. The Nag Hammadi texts suggested that early Christians in Egypt carried a vision of faith very different from the one later imposed by Rome. A vision that emphasized personal enlightenment, cosmic cycles, and knowledge as a path to salvation. In many ways, this looked more like a continuation of pharaonic thought than the centralized authority of the later church. If these writings had been widely accepted, the power of clerics would have been weakened. Faith would no longer depend on priests, but on direct experience of the divine. That is why, for centuries, such texts were labeled heretical, hidden away, or destroyed. The Nag Hammadi library survived only because someone in the 4th century buried it in the desert, perhaps knowing that one day the world would need to hear its message again. Today, scholars study these texts openly, but the Vatican remains silent, never integrating them into official doctrine. Their silence speaks volumes. The echoes of Egyptian cosmology within the lost Gospels remind us that the line between Christianity and Egypt is far thinner than we are taught. The desert of Nag Hammadi gave the world a glimpse of a different truth, one the Vatican has long preferred to keep buried. Why would the Vatican, the most powerful religious institution in Europe for over 1,000 years, go to such lengths to hide its ties to Egypt? The answer lies in 3 simple but dangerous motives: power, memory, and monopoly. Power is obvious. Whoever controls the flow of knowledge controls how people see the world. If the Church admitted that much of its theology, symbols, and rituals were borrowed from Egypt, its claim of divine uniqueness would weaken. The authority of the papacy rests on the belief that it holds exclusive truth, handed down directly from God. To reveal that this truth may have been inherited, rebranded, or even stolen from the Nile would shake the foundation of faith itself. Memory is equally important. History is not just a record of the past, it is the raw material of identity. People believe they know who they are because they are told where they come from. If Europeans were taught that their religious heritage was built on Egyptian cosmology and pharaonic rituals, their sense of Christian identity would shift. The story of light triumphing over pagan darkness would collapse, replaced by a story of continuity and borrowing. By erasing or obscuring Egypt, the Vatican ensured that people remembered the Middle Ages as dark, the Church as the sole guardian of light, and the Renaissance as its gift to humanity. Memory was rewritten to preserve authority. Then comes theological monopoly. Religion is not just about belief, it is about interpretation. Priests and popes exist because they are said to hold the keys to hidden truths. But Egyptian wisdom, from the Book of the Dead to the Hermetic texts, teaches that divine knowledge is already within each person, accessible through initiation and self-awakening. If that message had been preserved openly, the role of priests as intermediaries would have been unnecessary. People would not have needed confession, indulgences, or papal decrees. They would have sought truth in their own souls. For the Vatican, this was the greatest threat of all. By hiding Egypt, they maintained their monopoly over salvation. There may also be a deeper motive: fear. The Egyptians explored realms of astronomy, medicine, and ritual that even modern science struggles to explain. They built monuments that align with the stars, created mechanical wonders, and preserved knowledge that seems almost otherworldly. To admit that such wisdom once existed, and that it lay outside the boundaries of the Bible, would raise questions too dangerous for the Church to answer. Where did this knowledge come from? Who first taught it, and why was it lost? Silence was safer than facing those questions. In the end, the decision to hide Egypt was not random. It was a strategy, a centuries-long project to reshape memory, to claim divine uniqueness, and to keep people dependent on clerical authority. The sands of the Nile carried stories of eternal life, cosmic order, and the divinity of the human soul. But in Rome, those stories were locked away, replaced by a single narrative that placed the Vatican at the center. Egypt was not forgotten by accident. It was buried on purpose, so that only those in power could decide when or if the truth would rise again. The story of Egypt and the Vatican is one of shadows and light. Across centuries, we see fragments of a forgotten alliance, hints that the wisdom of the Nile did not vanish with the fall of the pharaohs, but was carried quietly into Rome, rebranded, reshaped, and hidden beneath marble and gold. The question that lingers is whether this was an act of preservation or an act of theft. Did the Vatican hold on to Egypt's knowledge in order to keep it alive for a future generation, or did it lock it away to ensure that the world would never be free to use it without permission? The answer is unclear, but the evidence whispers on every obelisk in St. Peter's Square and every sealed shelf in the Vatican archives. Egypt taught that words held power, that symbols could shape reality, that the soul was eternal, and that the stars guided human destiny. These ideas appear again and again in Christian theology, but often in altered form. The Ankh became the cross, Isis became the Virgin Mary, Osiris became the model for resurrection. What was once Egyptian became Roman, and then became Catholic. Was this transformation meant to honor Egypt by preserving its truths in a new form, or was it meant to erase the source and crown the Church as the sole origin of light? That is the dilemma history leaves us. If the Vatican truly preserved Egypt, then it deserves recognition as a guardian, holding safe a current of wisdom that might otherwise have been lost to fire, war, and forgetfulness. Without the Church's vaults and scribes, perhaps the Corpus Hermeticum, the lost Gospels, or fragments of ancient papyri would have vanished forever. In this view, the Vatican acted as a bridge, ensuring that Egypt's wisdom survived long enough to inspire the Renaissance and beyond. Humanity today still benefits from that survival, even if it came at the price of secrecy. But if the Vatican instead stole Egypt, then the story is darker. It means the Church silenced a civilization's voice, took its knowledge, and used it to consolidate its own power. It means that for over 1,000 years, people were taught to forget who first charted the stars, who first mapped the afterlife, who first taught that divinity could dwell within the human soul. It means that an entire civilization was turned into a ghost, its wisdom stripped of origin and dressed in new robes so that the world would never question where it truly came from. In the end, we are left with questions more powerful than answers. Perhaps both stories are true. Perhaps the Vatican preserved Egypt, but preserved it for itself, guarding the light while telling the world to remain in darkness. Perhaps the archives beneath Rome still hold scrolls, maps, and secrets that could change how we see history forever. And perhaps the truest act of power is not to destroy knowledge, but to delay it, to release it only when it serves the gatekeeper. So we must ask again, was the Vatican a guardian of Egypt's light, or was it the thief who locked that light away? Until the vaults open, the truth remains in the shadows, waiting.